I'm Dan Drake. This is Front Up on Visitor Network TV. Our guest is Rich Turer, who is here in his capacity as a commissioner of the Park and Recreation Commission, and in fact is the newest commissioner, having been appointed early in the summer.
Yes.
Welcome, Rich.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Let's talk generally about Park and Rec, and I realize that you bring a new and perhaps not fully educated perspective to it at this point, but let's take a stab at it anyway. The role of Park and Rec has evolved somewhat over the last few years into, how would you describe it today?
Well, interesting. I mean, if I may, before I raise my hand to say it, I'd like to consider being on the commission. I mean, part of my due diligence was speaking to some of the Board of Selectmen, some town management, I'll say generically. And I had an opportunity to speak and meet with Nash several times since I've been on Island in the latter part of 2012 to try to get an understanding of what's happening on Island and why is it changing so much. I think it's part of a reorganization, which is understandable. I think along the way with change, the communication has been a big challenge. And also understandably, I think part of the change with Park and Recreation, having the employees designated on their budget, had to do with town employee changes, which is always an interesting dilemma for the town to be communicating with unpaid commissioners at any sense.
But if a position is eliminated, forget the individual who's holding the position. If a position is eliminated or transferred, that can be communicated.
Yes, and it's a matter of when. I certainly when it happened, it was communicated, but then the commissioners knew as the general public did. Dan, you've been in business before I have too. I mean, with reorganization, sometimes I think if there's a different perspective I bring, it's moving costs on a ledger sheet from Park and Recreation to DPW.
Yeah, but that's not really the issue. From my perspective.
Okay.
The issue is what is Park and Rec charged with today, and does it have the tools within its grasp necessary to do that job?
Well, I think if you were to look at the mission statement, which is available on the town website for Park and Recreation, for DPW, even for visitor services, I think in taking a look at that, it still suggests that Park and Recreation, their mission is to provide, I use the word product and service, but to be responsible for maintaining beaches and parks and delivering recreation through the community. And right now there isn't a system and a structure in place, including a level of collaboration that I think is enabling the commission today to deliver against that statement.
Let's take the music festival as an example. And I understand, obviously there was some criticism of the way it was executed, and both or primarily, I guess, by the neighbors. But they came in, as I understand it, to the commission within the last week or so, and sort of had a discussion about how it went from their perspective, and I presume how they might do it better the next time. Is that correct?
I think so. I was a little surprised. I think it's a little early for, I would suggest it's a little early for the organizers, to be doing a full recap of an event. I think there's more due diligence that's required by the entire community to be able to sit down and have a more intelligent conversation. They know what some of the challenges were, and the challenges went beyond just weather, but that certainly affected the event. At that same meeting, the Tom Nevers Association had an opportunity to talk about many of their concerns for the event, promises that were made, or at least items of understanding that they don't think were delivered against. I think on September 10th, I believe it's that date, if I'm not mistaken, but in an upcoming Board of Selectmen meeting, on the agenda is a more thorough conversation, also inviting public commentary about the event. Know that the commissioners, the existing commissioners today, support the notion, that an event of that size, music related, can and does belong on Nantucket. That being said, I think first year...
You bring a certain bias to that.
I do. Yeah, I do. No, I do bring. But I'm speaking for the commission.
Right.
You know, I spoke to Nash today. I'm sorry he couldn't be here. He's off island on business. But you know, I spoke to Nash quite a bit again today about that. I think the commissioners feel strongly that an event such as that does belong on Nantucket. I think the debate would be when, where, scope, size, and that conversation I think will continue, and hopefully the 10th will be the beginning of that conversation, not the beginning and the end of that conversation.
Do you think the commission is inclined to let it happen again at Tom Nevers Field?
I think the inclination is that. There are many other events that take place at Tom Nevers Field. I so happen to live in town. I'm a member of the town association. I'm not so sure that all the events that take place in town are always presented to the town association on whether they're interested in that event taking place or not. I think as a matter of due diligence, speaking to any of the associations that line up with us civically, talk about something that's going to take place in the neighborhood is the right thing to do. It's the neighborly thing to do. But like, I can't imagine the Pops in the first year was a perfect event either. You know, and year 2 is usually better than year 1. And by the time you get to year 3, 4, and 5, it's you can almost do it with your eyes closed. So,
what about, is there a possibility that the Tom Nevers facility could get overused? I mean, to the point where it starts to need significant upgrading, rehabilitation, whatever the right word is. With all the, I mean, you have something like this. You have the fair. You have the roller derby. You have I don't know what all else that goes on out. Not the roller derby, the demolition derby.
Demolition derby, right?
And does it? You know, do you see the town being able to maintain it in a way that still makes it attractive for use by these groups?
I think that's a question right now. I mean, I challenge whether or not that Tom Nevers is managed in a condition that should be acceptable to the residents of Nantucket, regardless of how often it's used. So I think I would start from that standpoint. Whether there was one event there a year or 3 or 10, is it at a level that's acceptable to the community and is in keeping with the mission of Park and Recreation, DPW, or anybody else? I don't think it's a matter of always the number of events as it relates to field condition. It just has to be managed appropriately. And I question whether it has been. And I think additional events will continue to tax the condition of any of the properties on Nantucket, whether it's the town beaches or the town parks.
What other specific properties does Park and Rec oversee? I think Children's Beach is now under Visitor Services. Yeah,
sure. I mean, Park and Recreation and Visitor Services, I think, is relatively collaborative. Some of the responsibilities have been shifting over. You know, David Sharp is supporting Park and Recreation administratively, although Visitor Services, I think, with the new responsibilities, did not come with additional budgets and resources, so that, you know, that continues to tax them well. I probably am not the best person to list all of the different beaches, but we have everything from, you know, the skate park to Children's Beach to several of the public beaches in town.
Certainly the Jetties Beach.
Jetties Beach area. So there's been a lot of publicity of late, which I think is a good thing. Letters to the editor about some of the condition of the beaches, some of the access to the public beaches for people that are having difficulty. I think that's a really great conversation for the town. You know, and our hopes are that Park and Recreation can play a productive role in making sure that things get fixed, get better, and are in the condition that they should be, regardless of who has the responsibility or the budget to mow the field or trim.
One of the problems is you have a lot of go-to people. You have DPW, you have Visitor Services, you have the police department, the fire department, all these people play into what Park and Rec oversees and does. But you have responsibility, but no authority.
I think that's mostly right. I mean, I think that Park and Recreation, working with police, fire, emergency services, Board of Selectmen, that's kind of always been the case, depending on the size of the event. I mean, that's part of the approval processes. But yes, I think the ownership issue as we sit here today. You know, the who's the go-to that's going to manage through the process for...
And who's the ultimate pigeon if something goes wrong? Who's going to get shot?
Dan, I think that's a great question. I think the towns, you know, folks that live here have been posing that more publicly. People that I speak to, you know, question whether or not the right process is in place. There's a lot of confusion on who you go to and for what purpose. What role do the different organizations play? And my hopes are, you know, over the next 3 to 6 months that we can have that conversation. I know there's an opportunity. It just became informed today. There's an opportunity for Park and Recreation to consider funding an island-wide survey in January and February, working in partnership with the town of Nantucket. So, and speaking to Nash, I would recommend that we certainly pursue that.
Nash Strudwick, who's the chairman of the commission.
Thank you. That we certainly pursue a path of looking at how best to organize and where the right funding comes from, and then how do we benchmark what is acceptable to the town, because I do think that that's suspect right now.
Yeah, I mean, the case of the field markings, I think was a very good example of what the issue is. I mean, you had so many people with a finger in that pot, but nobody ultimately with the responsibility to serve the stew, so to speak.
Yeah, I went out and met with you know, Rich Brannigan out at the fields just probably 3 to 4 weeks ago now, and there's still issues there that are unresolved. I mean, there's been a huge investment to put a turf field down. We can talk about the issue with the lines, but there's many other issues that still need resolve and closure. I mean,
such as
believe it or not, I'll call it a sprinkler system, but there was a sprinkler system installed. There's a particular
irrigation.
Well, there's a particular reason why even a turf field needs to be watered down, and it's beyond just managing temperature in the heat of the summertime. It's for proper maintenance. So while that was put in, and so as it relates to the irrigation system or the water system, I guess I would call it. It's been installed. It was part of the investment with CPC, but the appropriate hose isn't even in place for the folks to be managing it properly. The field is also supposed to be raked, believe it or not, for an artificial turf field, and this is all based on my meeting and understanding and conversation with Rich Brannigan.
And he's the soccer coach at the high school.
That's
right?
correct. Manages, yes, and that and all of the other you know, summer leagues for children. And in speaking to Rich, they have the equipment, the rake, but they don't have the appropriate equipment to pull the rake. So it's those type of issues. There's been this big investment, and there aren't 2 new goals for the new field, so they're dragging goals across a new turf field as well. So you know, it's all of those things can be solved for. You know, the issue is who owns it. Who's the right voice? How do you move those projects forward and get them to closure that's appropriate? So there's many issues still at the soccer field that go beyond just whether the lines can be installed without damaging the turf.
What are some of the other hot issues right now for the Park and Rec Commission?
Well, you know, I think I'm not sure that it's a hot issue. I think the whole organization ownership piece is the biggest key that needs to be solved for in town, and that residents have a voice, and that's the number one issue I think for Park and Recreation now. Do they have a purpose? What's that purpose? Does it require funding? How else might we organize it for the betterment of the community? I think that's the number one issue. But there's other issues. There's discussions about fees for public spaces, and whether the fees are appropriate, and whether the fee should be adjusted, whether you're a for-profit or a not-for-profit, and how do you manage that objectively? I think that's a great conversation to be having, and I think somebody having an event on town property that's delivering 100% of the proceeds to an island charity might feel a little bit different, you know, than in a for-profit entity that's delivering a portion of the proceeds.
You still have to understand that whether you're for-profit or not-for-profit, you have to understand that there's a cost. that
Yes.
goes with it.
That's correct.
And, if you really wanted to be Scrooges, you could argue that the not-for-profits don't pay taxes, whereas the for-profits do. So, it gets really hairy.
Fair.
And
Fair. But I don't think it's been addressed.
I'm not advocating that. by the
No,
way. I'm just
I
saying.
think you were. No, good point. I think the issue about, any event of size is going to be intrusive to the residents here, regardless of the community. And I don't need to name some of the events that
Right.
can be intrusive, but some of the events are also great for the residents. They're great for visitors. They're right for the town. They deliver money for nonprofits that are important here. But it shouldn't be free, and it should be managed properly. And the property where the event takes place should be delivered at least at the same level and quality that it was given before the event takes place. And I think all of the fee structures need to be adjusted and accommodated based on all of those factors. And I think that's an important issue actually for town to figure out, and Park and Rec.
Well, I think it is too, and I appreciate your coming and sharing your views on the subject today. I think it's something we all need to think about, and there needs to be a public debate about. And hopefully, your survey will happen and will cause the level of debate to be increased to the point where some answers can be obtained and then acted on.
Yeah, I'd like to think that Park and Recreation should be less about debate.
It should be, but
and more about.
and you need higher ratings, right?
Yeah, well, that's right. I think most people would nod their head and say the products and the services and the fields that need to be managed can or should be managed better, and what's the right way to organize it.
How
so
many
it's
people
managed
really
better.
know what Park and Rec's responsibilities are? I mean, in terms of the properties. Tom Nevers, there's no sign out there that says this is under the jurisdiction of the Park and Recreation Commission.
Right.
So it's something that people take for granted.
Right.
And if this debate is going to be useful, I would suggest that maybe you need to raise your profile.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that thought.
Gratuitous advice.
That hasn't been a problem in the past.
Rich
But,
Turer, thank
thanks,
you
Dan.
very much.
Dan, thanks. Good seeing you.
Nice to see you.